Good morning. I hope you're having a good morning this morning, and I hope that when you leave here, you'll be even having a better morning. We're looking into Ephesians chapter 5 as part of our series, and Ephesians chapter 5 is most famous for its marriage pronouncements. And most people, when they start talking about marriage, run down to chapter 5, verse 22, and go from there. I've learned over the years that in marriage counseling, in premarital counseling, that's an important place, but it's not the most important place. It's just one of the important places. So I'm going to start this morning on verse 1. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1. And Paul says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved Christians, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." Now we recognize that the first 21 verses of chapter 5 are talking about the church. Christ and the church is the principal thrust here. So we start talking about marriage in verse 22. But I've learned that those verses before you get to 22 are as important as those in verse 22 and beyond. So Paul opens talking about Christ giving himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. He's going to come back here in the marriage part and start talking about husbands and wives. Now, when he talks about husbands and wives, he's going to reference the relationship with Christ. And so what he says about Christ and the church here is very applicable to husbands and wives. Some of the same references that he makes. So when he says, "Be imitators of God as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it," if you're going to be a husband, prepare to give yourself up for your wife. Prepare to be the sacrifice for her that Christ was for the church. And it is an offering to God, likewise, when you are kind to your wife. And when you get into marital difficulties, they're very hard to straighten out. But I think what Paul says about the church here is good ground to prepare for a marriage. He says, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not be named among you as proper among saints." Well, if that's not proper among saints, it's certainly not proper in your marriage. It's certainly not proper in your family. So, men, you're looking for a wife, you want to marry some nice lady and establish a family. You cannot carry sexual immorality, impurity, and covetousness into that relationship. So this is good preparation ground to build a solid marriage. He says, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, or things which are out of place. Instead, let there be thanksgiving." That's good advice for the church, and that's good advice for husbands. And he says, make sure that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure or covetous or idolater has no inheritance in the kingdom of God. And he will have little comfort in his family if those are problems. And so we find as Paul speaks to the church about the relationship with God, He's laying the groundwork to talk to men about their relationship with their wives and wives about their relationship with their husbands. He says down in verse 10, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Guess what? What is pleasing to the Lord is often pleasing to your wife also. And it's often pleasing to your husband also. So Paul is laying the groundwork here for not just a good church, but he's laying the groundwork here for a good marriage. Down in verse 15, he says, walk not as the unwise, but the wise, making best use of time because the days are evil. If Paul could say in those days that the days were evil, he had plenty of evidence to back that up. Any people who would hang Jesus Christ on the cross are not nice people. And Paul says this is a characteristic of our time, that the days are evil. If Paul could step out on our streets today and look at what's going on today, how would he characterize our generation? I think Paul would come to that same conclusion, that as we look around, we can see that the days are evil, even among our own town, even in our own neighborhood. The days are evil. And so Paul would prepare us for marriage by saying, marriage is going to have to rise above the surrounding culture that you live in. It's going to have to rise to a standard that God would prescribe. And so he says in verse 18, do not get drunk with wine. That is debauchery. Men, if you're going to get married, you're going to have to give something up. I don't know your life. I don't know your prospective wife's life. But I do know that you'll probably have to give something up. I hope it's not your ski boat or your bass boat. But whatever it is, one of those things would have to be some of that getting drunk with wine. If that's your habit, you can expect that's going to be a problem in the marriage. Addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart. That's part of the pleasant part of Sunday worship, singing together. I hope I'm not revealing any secrets, but my wife and I sit down on the couch every night and sing some hymns. Yes, we just recently began this because she just recently began playing the piano and learned to read music. And so this has added a dimension to our marriage. It has added a dimension to our relationship. We've even made a recording or two. They're not fit for public presentation, but we enjoy them. So life is about getting ready for marriage. And then when you come to that time, Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands as is the Lord. This is usually where the trouble starts, isn't it? You usually have some lady that says, well, that may have been good in Paul's day, but she didn't know my husband. That may be good advice in general, but for me, I'm special. And so that's the way that women sometimes look at that verse and say, what is God trying to do to me to link me with this man, and I am supposed to submit to him. Well, that's the way we read that verse a lot, but we need to read the rest of that verse. It says, submit to your husbands even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. What did Jesus give that we might be his church? He gave his life. He gave everything. He gave his entire being that we might be the church. So husbands, if you're looking for a wife who can give everything you need to your family and leave you living your life of ease and pleasure, or whatever your hobby is, or wherever you go, then you're going to have trouble, because Christ gave himself for the church. And we will have to give some of ourselves to the marriage if it's going to be a good, solid marriage. So, wives, if the first part of that verse bothers you, it may be because the second part of that verse is not reflecting your husband. And if it's a new marriage, I can say be patient, give him a little time, help him be educated, and whatever. But somewhere down the road, this relationship is going to have to mature and become as Christ and his church, that relationship. We would give our lives for each other. Christ not only gave his life for us, but he asked us to give our lives to him. So marriage is going to ask nothing less than Christ asked of his church, that we give our lives for and to each other. He says, now the church submits to Christ, so wives should also submit in everything to their husbands. And if you're submitting everything to Christ and to your wife, you're cutting the devil out of that formula. And that would help a lot of marriages if we could just cut the devil out of the formula. But he's always there, always willing to jump in, always willing to whisper in your ear. But Jesus gives us what we need to know. He gives us the truth. He gives us the facts that will work in life. I saw some figures the other day about how many people were in the hospital, how many died of this dread disease. And all of that was overshadowed by the number of abortions that were done in this same time. And I stopped to think, what is it that's causing all these abortions? And I asked the question to a group, do you think all these abortions would be occurring if all these people were wives in a good relationship? And maybe this was an unplanned child. Some of those turn out to be tremendous blessings. Maybe this was not what you really wanted at the time, but you can make it work. If your relationship is a good, solid relationship, and God designed this relationship to make it work. It works for the church. It works for families, that we structure these things as God had them be structured. Now, I know today you can marry any mammal on the face of the earth that you wish to marry. And some lady in England is going to court so that she can marry a chandelier or some such object. And where's the end? These days are evil. There is no end to the foolishness. But God laid this plan out as one that works for the church. He gave himself for the church. The church gives itself for him. And husbands give themselves for their wives. Wives give themselves for their husbands. And it's a plan that has worked for centuries and centuries. So we look at these things, and if we can get them in the proper order and deal with our wives. Men, think of this. How does Christ deal with the church? He is the head of the church. He is the boss. He gives us his word, doesn't he? He doesn't holler. He doesn't raise his voice. But he gave his life for us. So we listen intently. And if we follow that formula, we will have the strongest relationships in the world, both the church and the family. And there is an old saying that you hear up north, happy wife, happy life. I was a little shocked first time I heard that. Happy wife, happy life. Well, that has a ring to it, doesn't it? But that's not really the way we say it down south. Down south, we say, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And that is the nature of this relationship. We're here for each other, not one to hold it together and one to do something else. So, in this same way, as Christ loved the church, we love our wives. And he speaks to the husbands, says, same way husbands should love their wives, as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. What's Paul saying back in chapter 3 of Ephesians? The church, chapter 1, the church is his body. The wife is our wife, and we are giving our bodies. And he says, therefore, let a man leave his father and mother. Marriage counseling often reveals this problem, that one or both have not left their mother and father. And Paul only mentions the women because it's probably more important that the women be close to their mother than the father. But the man must leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. And the wife must cling to him, and they become one flesh. And this relationship, he says, is referring to the mystery of Christ and his church. Strong spiritual relationships, but they're relationships between the man and his wife, not the man and her family, not her and his family. It's man and wife, and in a good social relationship, the rest of it will come natural. And he says, to sum this up, the two shall become one flesh. That's indeed a mystery, isn't it? But it's only a mystery for the first 30, 40 years you're married. After the next 20, 30 years you're married, then it becomes more obvious that the two of you are just one flesh. You cannot imagine living without the other one. Wife and I have this constant thing going. Which one of us has to die first? And we always choose ourselves rather than the other one, because neither one of us looks forward to living without the other one. We have become one flesh. And in a sort of sideways way, we look over at our kids. Each one of those kids is part of us. but they are their own person. They are just one piece of flesh. So this lesson is deep, and he sums it up rather briefly in the last verse of the chapter. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Those are pretty simple things to do. That's a pretty simple conclusion. But as you can see in all that went before, it's not a simple thing to do. It's like Christ giving himself for the church. We will give ourselves for our relationship. And as Christ calls us to heaven, we'll go there wondering what's to be, since there's no marriage in heaven, and we're both looking forward to going to heaven. We'll probably have some sort of relationship up there, maybe even closer than husband and wife. But Jesus speaks to those people who will follow him, and when we do, he takes care of all the details. We encourage you this morning to be with Christ when he calls. Be with your wife and husband when they call. And let's be families as we are church. We thank you this morning.